The scent of cinnamon and pine was thick in the air, but I barely noticed as I stared at the text on my phone. You'll be cooking Christmas dinner for 40 this year. Alone. Be ready by 10 a.m. That was all it said, sent by my daughter-in-law Amber with her usual lack of punctuation or regard. I read it twice, then a third time, standing in the narrow hallway of the home I no longer recognized as mine. It wasn't a question or a request. It was a command, and one that assumed I had nothing better to do than dedicate my holiday to feeding her extended family. My hands trembled as I held the phone, partly from anger and partly from disbelief. There was no please, no can you help, just a cold, entitled demand from a woman who treated me more like a housemaid than her husband's mother. Amber had always had a flair for making me feel small, but this was something else entirely. She knew what she was doing, and this time I wasn't going to let her win. Let me back up before we get to the airport terminal and the clink of a complimentary drink. My name is Eileen Porter. I'm 67 years old, and I used to love Christmas more than anything in the world. It was Frank's favorite holiday, too. My husband of 42 years, now 3 years gone. We used to hang lights the day after Thanksgiving, play carols too loudly, and bake enough cookies to feed a small army. Back then, the house was filled with warmth and laughter, and the idea of cooking for family brought me joy instead of dread. But when Frank passed away and the bills mounted, I sold the house and moved in with my son Eric and his wife Amber. It was supposed to be temporary, just until I got back on my feet, but temporary turned into 4 years of unpaid labor disguised as familial duty. At first, it was little things: babysitting, folding laundry, helping with school projects. But it didn't stay little for long. Somehow, I became the unpaid nanny, maid, chauffeur, and cook. If you have a similar story about betrayal from the people you least expect, tell us in the comments and don't forget to subscribe. They never said it directly, but the implication was always clear. I was lucky to live there. Lucky to have a roof over my head, even if it was a converted basement with no windows and a mattress that made my hips ache. Lucky to be included even if I was only included when they needed something. Amber rarely spoke to me unless it was to delegate a task, and when she did, it was with that clipped tone that made me feel like a stray dog she tolerated out of pity. Eric was no better. He had become a shadow of the boy I raised, silent, passive, always looking away when things got uncomfortable. "It's just until we pay off the car," he'd said that first winter. "It's just until we get through preschool fees," he'd added the next year. But the years kept passing, and the requests kept coming, and I kept shrinking. Christmas was the worst. It wasn't just the work. It was the erasure. My traditions were ignored. My recipes critiqued. My decorations boxed up and replaced with sleek, sterile ornaments from some influencer's collection. Last year, Amber had banned my ceramic nativity set, claiming it clashed with her modern minimalist aesthetic. I'd made a ham that year, the way Frank liked it. Honey glazed, slow roasted, with cloves studded like little black jewels. But Amber declared it too heavy and made a show of ordering a vegan platter from a catering service halfway through dinner. "Next year, let's stick to clean eating," she'd said, dabbing her lip with a linen napkin. I had smiled through gritted teeth. But when that text came this year, when she demanded I cook for 40 people, without so much as a kind word, something inside me cracked. I stood in the pantry, still holding my phone, the flickering light overhead buzzing like a hornet. 40 people. 40. I could already see the day unfolding in front of me. The 4 a.m. wake-up, the frantic peeling and chopping, the dozen side dishes, the desserts, the turkey, the vegan alternative, the gluten-free casserole Amber's cousin needed, the arguments over gravy, the mess, the cleanup, the exhaustion. And not one person would thank me. Not one. They never did. I could hear Amber's voice already, barking out orders, complaining about the lack of rosemary, nitpicking the pie crust. That was when I realized something startling. I didn't have to do this. I didn't owe them my sanity, my body, or my time. I was not a servant, and I had nothing to prove. I walked back to my room, the laundry-adjacent storage nook they let me call a bedroom, and pulled my old suitcase from the closet. It was dusty and stiff, a relic from another life, from cruises and anniversary weekends in cities with lights and jazz and dancing. I laid it open on the bed and began packing. Not everything, just enough to get by. A few dresses, my bathing suit, my good sandals, and that floral shawl Frank had bought me in Key West. It smelled faintly of sea salt and his cologne, and I pressed it to my face for a long moment before folding it carefully. My passport was still valid, tucked behind a photo of Frank and me on our 30th anniversary trip to Mexico. I opened my laptop, hands trembling slightly, and typed in last-minute holiday flights. There were plenty. People cancel all the time. And there it was, a flight to Lisbon, Portugal, leaving at 6:45 a.m. the next morning. One seat left in business class. The price made me wince, but I clicked confirm anyway. I didn't care. Not anymore. The money I'd saved for emergencies now felt well spent, because what could be more of an emergency than losing yourself entirely? I wrote a note and placed it on the kitchen counter. No explanations, just the truth. I will not be cooking your Christmas dinner. I'll be having mine in Portugal. Bon appetit. I thought about leaving a sandwich in the fridge like some sort of twisted peace offering, but then I thought better of it. Let them figure it out. Let Amber cook for once, or order in, or stand in the kitchen and cry like she did when the Wi-Fi went out. I was done being everyone's solution. I was finally choosing myself. At 3 a.m., I slipped out the back door, the suitcase wheels humming softly against the pavement. Snow had started to fall, soft and silent, blanketing the world in white. It felt like a blessing, like a curtain being drawn over a scene I no longer needed to watch. The taxi driver gave me a curious look as he loaded my suitcase into the trunk. "Heading out for the holidays?" he asked. I smiled, watching the house disappear behind me. "Yes," I said. "For the first time in a long time, I really am." The airport was strangely peaceful in those early hours, the kind of quiet that feels like the world has paused just for you. I moved through the check-in and security lines with a kind of serenity I hadn't known I could feel. The woman who checked my passport smiled and wished me a Merry Christmas, and for the first time in years, I actually believed it could be. As I sat at the gate sipping lukewarm coffee from a paper cup, I wondered what Amber would do when she saw my note. She'd probably assume it was a joke at first, some kind of passive-aggressive protest that would end with me back in the kitchen by sunrise. But as the hours ticked by and the oven remained cold, reality would begin to settle in. She'd open the fridge and find it empty, no prepped ingredients, no neatly labeled containers, no spreadsheet taped to the door like I'd done the year before. She might yell, she might panic, she might call Eric and ask where I was. Eric wouldn't know. And by the time they put it all together, I'd be 30,000 feet in the air, unreachable. Boarding the plane felt like shedding my old skin. I walked down the jet bridge with my head high, shoulders back, and the quiet glee of someone who had made a decision without asking anyone's permission. Business class was more luxurious than I remembered. Wide seats, real glasses, and warm towels that made me feel like a person again. I accepted a glass of champagne with a quiet, "Thank you," and settled into my window seat. Outside, the sun was beginning to rise, casting the tarmac in gold and blush. I closed my eyes and pictured Amber trying to figure out how to thaw a turkey she hadn't bought, or Google how long mashed potatoes take. Maybe she'd scream. Maybe she'd cry. Or maybe, just maybe, she'd finally realize what I'd been doing all these years. Midway through the flight, I pulled out my notebook and began to write. Not a letter, not a diary entry, just thoughts, observations, fragments of memory stitched together like patchwork. I wrote about Frank, about the smell of cinnamon in his hair when he baked, about the way he always insisted on singing off-key Christmas carols while I cooked. I wrote about the way I felt small every time Amber criticized my food or called me extra. I wrote about the time Eric forgot my birthday because Amber had double-booked him for a golf retreat. I wrote about all the little ways I'd disappeared since moving into that house. The way I'd stopped wearing perfume because Amber said it irritated her sinuses. The way I'd stopped watching my shows because they weren't age-appropriate for the kids. I filled 5 pages before the words finally stopped coming, and then I closed the notebook and leaned back. The flight attendant came by with breakfast and called me Ms. Porter, and it startled me how good it felt to be addressed by my own name. Not Mom, not Granny, not Hey, but Eileen Porter, person, Traveler, woman reclaiming her life. Landing in Lisbon felt like stepping into a dream. The air was crisp but not cold, and the sky overhead was an endless blue canvas without a single cloud. The airport bustled with families, couples, and fellow solo travelers, each cloaked in the hum of holiday adventure. I checked into a small boutique hotel in the heart of the old city, with wrought iron balconies and the scent of oranges drifting through the hallways. My room was on the top floor, small but elegant, with terracotta tiles and thick quilts on the bed. From the window I could see the red rooftops of Lisbon stretching toward the sea, and church bells ringing in the distance. I unpacked slowly, savoring the lack of urgency, the absence of anyone knocking at the door asking where the gravy boat was. Later, I wandered into the narrow streets lined with bakeries and shops, my scarf wrapped tightly around my neck. I had nowhere to be, no one to impress, and for once, that felt like the truest gift of the season. That first evening, I found a tiny restaurant tucked between two alleyways, glowing with soft lantern light and humming with quiet conversation. The waiter spoke English with a lilting accent and recommended the codfish stew, which I ordered without hesitation. I sipped red wine while the dish simmered, listening to the clink of cutlery and the murmur of voices in Portuguese. At the next table sat an older couple holding hands, their fingers intertwined over a shared dessert. I didn't feel envious, as I might have a year ago. I felt grateful for the memory of love, for the freedom to dine alone, for the warmth of a meal I didn't have to cook. When the food arrived, I closed my eyes after the first bite, letting the flavor settle into me like a benediction. Outside, the lights of the city blinked like stars come to rest on earth. I lingered until closing, tipping generously, and walking back to the hotel with the steady calm of someone who didn't owe anyone anything. The next morning, I slept past 9, a decadent indulgence that once would have been unthinkable. No children knocking on the door, no list of tasks taped to the fridge, no shrill voice from upstairs asking if the pies were done yet. I brewed coffee in the room's little kettle and sat on the balcony in my robe, watching the city stir awake. There was a street performer below playing the violin, the melody floating upward like a ribbon. I felt something shift inside me then, a soft untangling of knots I hadn't realized were there. Guilt, duty, fear, the need to be useful. They loosened their grip, at least for that moment. I didn't check my phone. I didn't think about the time difference. I didn't wonder if the dinner had been a disaster. Whatever had happened back in that house, it was no longer mine to carry. Later that day I took a tram to Belém, the historic district by the water, where the tower watched over the Tagus River like a sentinel. I wandered through the monastery, ran my fingers along ancient stone walls, and listened to tourists whispering in languages I didn't understand. I bought a pastel de nata from a bakery so famous the line wrapped around the building, and when I finally bit into the warm, flaky pastry, I let myself moan aloud in delight. A woman next to me laughed and said, "First time?" And I nodded, my cheeks flushed. We struck up a conversation, and I learned her name was Ingrid, a retired school teacher from Norway traveling alone for the holidays. "My children told me it was dangerous," she said with a shrug. "But I told them it was more dangerous to stay where I wasn't seen." I felt something bloom in my chest at that. Recognition, resonance, the strange comfort of meeting someone who understood without needing the full story. We walked together for hours, two women of a certain age, with stories written in different languages but the same ink. That evening, I finally turned my phone back on. It buzzed like a hive. Dozens of missed calls, frantic messages, even voicemails. Most were from Eric. "Mom, where are you? Call me. Please, this isn't funny. People are arriving and nothing is ready. Amber is losing it. Did you really leave? Like actually leave?" I scrolled past them with a kind of detached curiosity, as if reading someone else's misfortune. Amber's texts were sharper, colder. "This is completely unacceptable. You've embarrassed us. How dare you abandon your family on Christmas?" I didn't respond. I didn't need to. My silence was the response. The only message I responded to was from Lily, my granddaughter, who'd sent a quiet, "Grandma, are you okay?" and nothing else. That one made my throat tighten, because Lily had always been different. Observant, gentle, just a little too wise for her 12 years. I typed, "I'm safe, sweetheart. Just taking a little trip for myself. I love you. Merry Christmas," and hit send before I could second-guess it. The rest could wait, or better yet, disappear into the ether of unread notifications. I didn't owe explanations to people who'd never asked how I was doing, only what I could do for them. I silenced the phone and dropped it into the drawer beside my bed, as if tucking away a part of my old life. Outside, the streets of Lisbon sparkled with holiday lights strung across narrow alleys, casting golden halos over balconies and shop windows. I wrapped myself in my shawl and stepped out into the festive night, determined to reclaim the holiday on my own terms. It wasn't what I expected Christmas to look like, but maybe that was the point. Maybe the best traditions were the ones you created for yourself. I found a Christmas Eve concert at a small chapel tucked behind a bookstore, barely advertised and mostly attended by locals. The pews were filled with families, older couples, and the occasional solo traveler like me, all gathered in reverent silence beneath the vaulted ceiling. The choir sang in Portuguese, but the music needed no translation. Each note threaded through me like silver threads stitching a heart back together. I closed my eyes and let the sound wash over me, not thinking about who was cooking dinner back home or whether the vegan casserole turned out. None of it mattered anymore. Frank would have loved this place. The wood beams, the scent of candle wax, the way the walls carried the music like it was sacred. I could almost feel him beside me, his hand warm in mine, his shoulder just brushing mine like it had for 4 decades. For the first time in 3 years, I let myself believe he wasn't entirely gone. Not when the music was this beautiful and the night this still. He would have been proud of me for walking away. After the concert, I wandered through the Bairro Alto district, where street musicians played accordion under strands of lights and cafe owners handed out glasses of warm vino quente. I accepted one with a smile and leaned against a stone wall, watching children chase each other across cobbled stones while their parents laughed behind them. It struck me how far I was from the noise and control of my old life, how none of these people knew me as the woman who folded laundry for a thankless daughter-in-law. Here I was just Eileen, traveler, stranger, someone with mystery instead of obligation. A man with a kind face and a salt and pepper beard asked if I wanted a photo taken. I handed him my phone, and he captured me mid-laugh with the cathedral behind me, the lights soft and gold. "That's a good one," he said, handing it back. I nodded, looking at the picture and barely recognizing myself, not because I looked different, but because I looked free. For the first time in years, I wanted to remember a moment exactly as it was. Christmas morning dawned gently, without the clatter of pots or the sting of harsh voices echoing through the house. I awoke to sunlight spilling through gauzy curtains and the distant sound of church bells. There were no presents under a tree, no demands for breakfast, no one asking if I'd remembered the nut-free stuffing or the dairy-free whipped cream. I brewed strong Portuguese coffee and drank it slowly on my balcony, watching the city stretch and blink in the golden morning. I didn't feel lonely. I felt light, like someone who'd been carrying invisible weights for so long she'd forgotten what it meant to walk upright. Frank had always told me I gave too much of myself away, and now I finally understood what he meant. Giving should come from love, not guilt. Sacrifice should be mutual, not expected. And family should never be a burden you carry alone while they ride comfortably on your back. I decided to splurge and booked myself into a Christmas brunch at a historic hotel overlooking the river, all white tablecloths and chandeliers. The maitre d' seated me near a window and didn't blink when I said the reservation was for one. I was surrounded by people, some in couples, some in families, some alone like me, and no one seemed to mind. I ordered eggs poached in port wine, roasted chestnuts, and a tart made with figs and almonds. Every bite felt like an act of restoration, like I was feeding a part of myself I'd neglected for too long. I didn't rush. I didn't think about calories or budgets or who else needed feeding. I raised a glass of champagne to Frank, to Lisbon, to second chances. A waiter passed by and asked if I was celebrating something, and I said yes, myself. He grinned and said that was the best reason of all. That afternoon, I wandered into a tiny gallery tucked between a wine shop and a tailor. The paintings were all by local women, bright abstracts, soft portraits, wild landscapes done in sweeping brushstrokes. One canvas stopped me cold. A woman standing at the edge of a cliff, wind tugging at her shawl, sea spray in her face, her eyes closed as if she were listening to something only she could hear. I stared at it for a long time, feeling like the woman on the canvas was some version of me that had been waiting to be seen. The gallery owner came over, a small woman in oversized glasses, and told me the artist was her sister. She paints the moment women finally take the first breath they didn't know they were holding, she said softly. I bought the painting without hesitation, even though I didn't know where I'd hang it. I just knew it needed to come with me, like a reminder of the breath I'd just taken. That night, I took a long bath in the clawfoot tub at the hotel, the water laced with lavender and eucalyptus oil. I lay there in the stillness, letting my body relax in ways it hadn't since before I moved in with Eric and Amber. No one was knocking. No one was calling my name. No one was tapping their wristwatch or saying they'd just do it themselves with that edge of martyrdom Amber had perfected. I closed my eyes and pictured what might be happening back at their house. Amber probably scrambling with last-minute delivery orders, guests quietly judging the chaos, Eric making excuses and blaming me. Let them talk. Let them invent whatever story made them feel less foolish. I was done explaining myself to people who'd never tried to understand me. I opened my phone again that night, not to respond, but to see what silence had stirred. Eric had left a voicemail that began with frustration and ended with something softer. Mom, I don't know what's going on, but I'm sorry. I think I'm starting to understand. Please just call and let me know you're okay. There were messages from Lily again, short, sweet, and never prying. Hope you're having a good Christmas, Grandma. I miss you. Dad's been quiet. Mom's still mad, but I think she knows she messed up. That one made me smile, bittersweet and slow. Maybe Lily would grow up different. Maybe she'd remember this Christmas not for the missing dinner, but for the lesson it left behind. If you're still listening to my story, please take a moment to subscribe. It only takes a few seconds for you, but it makes a big difference for me. The next morning, I received an email from Eric with the subject line, "I understand now." It surprised me more than I expected. He was never the one to initiate uncomfortable conversations. The message was longer than I thought he was capable of writing, filled with awkward phrasing and typos, but I read every word. He explained how the dinner had fallen apart, how Amber had tried to cook but burned the green beans, how the turkey never thawed because she forgot to take it out of the freezer, how their guests had arrived to a half-empty table and cold delivery pasta. He admitted they argued in front of everyone, and how half the family left early, murmuring excuses and glancing uncomfortably at the chaos. "I kept looking for you," he wrote, "even though I knew you weren't coming back through that door." He said he never realized how much I did until I didn't do it. He said he was sorry. Truly, fully sorry. Not just for Christmas, but for the years that led up to it. And then he ended the message with a line that stunned me. "If you decide to come home, things will be different. If you don't, I understand why." I sat with that message for a long time, rereading certain parts until the words blurred. The temptation to respond was strong, but I knew better than to jump at the first apology. Change takes more than regret. It takes action, and I hadn't seen that from him yet. Still, it meant something that he was beginning to see me clearly for the first time in years. It wasn't that I needed his guilt, but rather his recognition, that I had value beyond the chores and casseroles. I wrote back 2 lines. "I'm safe. Thank you for the message." That was all I could give for now. No promises, no reassurances. I needed space to understand what I wanted, not what they needed. And in Lisbon, every corner seemed to whisper that it was okay to be selfish, for once in my life. I decided to extend my stay by another week, booking the same room with the balcony that overlooked the tiled rooftops. The hotel staff was delighted, offering me a holiday discount and a complimentary massage. I took it, of course. I was learning to say yes to things that brought me joy. That afternoon, I met Ingrid again for coffee, and we swapped Christmas stories over slices of almond cake. She'd had her own small rebellion, telling her grown sons she wouldn't be hosting their families this year because she needed time for herself. They were furious, she said with a shrug, "but I've hosted every year for 30 years. It's their turn." I nodded, struck by how many women I'd met recently who were done being everything for everyone. Maybe we weren't selfish. Maybe we were simply done being invisible, and maybe that was the most radical act of all. We wandered the flea markets after coffee, rummaging through old books, hand-woven scarves, and dusty records from another era. I bought a delicate silver bracelet etched with stars, simple and elegant, and slipped it on like armor. Ingrid found a painted tile with blue roses that reminded her of her grandmother's kitchen, and she bought it without hesitation. We walked and talked until the sun dipped behind the hills, and then we hugged goodbye like old friends even though we'd only met twice. Back in my room, I wrapped myself in a borrowed robe and stared at the city lights flickering below. I didn't miss the noise, the chaos, the passive-aggressive comments over Christmas breakfast. I missed Lily's laughter, sometimes. I missed the version of Eric that used to call me just to say hi. But I didn't miss the role I'd been playing. The tired woman expected to smile through it all. On New Year's Eve, I stood among strangers in the Praça do Comércio, wrapped in my shawl, listening to the echo of fireworks bounce across the river. The night was alive with music, laughter, and the shimmer of champagne glasses held high. I counted down with the crowd, voice rising with strangers who became a temporary family under the Lisbon sky. When the clock struck midnight, I whispered to the air, "Two beginnings," and let the moment wash over me like a baptism. All around me, people hugged and kissed and danced in the streets. I just stood still, hands in my pockets, heart pounding quietly but firmly, like it had remembered its own rhythm. Somewhere across the ocean, Amber was probably nursing her wounded pride, and Eric might still be trying to clean up the mess they'd made without me. I hoped Lily was asleep, dreaming of a world where her grandmother wasn't afraid to say no. I didn't know what the new year would bring, but for once, that didn't terrify me. The next day, I received a voicemail from Amber, brittle and clipped like porcelain about to crack. "Eileen, I think we should talk. I may have said things that were misinterpreted. I didn't mean to offend you." Her voice faltered before continuing. "I understand you were overwhelmed, but leaving the way you did, it was unfair." I played it twice, listening for the apology that never quite came. Amber wasn't sorry. She was embarrassed, and maybe even scared, but not remorseful. Not yet. I deleted the message without replying. I wasn't going to reward someone who only acknowledged my pain when it threatened her convenience. Let her sit with the silence, for once. A few days later, I booked a day trip to Sintra, a nearby town nestled in the hills, filled with palaces and gardens that looked like they'd been plucked from fairy tales. The train ride there was quiet, mist clinging to the windows, and I sat with my thoughts as the landscape changed from city to countryside. At the Palacio de Peña, I walked through rooms where queens once lived, their voices long faded into the stone. I marveled at the painted ceilings and ornate tiles. But it was the gardens that took my breath away. Paths curved through ancient trees and moss-covered fountains, winding like secrets through the hills. I sat on a bench overlooking the valley and pulled out my notebook again. This time, I wrote a letter, not to Eric, not to Amber, but to myself. "Dear Eileen, you have done enough," I began. "You are enough, even when you do nothing at all." The words came easily after that, like water finally finding a crack in the dam. I wrote about my childhood, about how I was taught that love looked like service. I wrote about the way I had molded myself to fit others, expectations, shrinking my desires until they felt like indulgences instead of rights. I wrote about Frank, how he'd seen me even when I tried to disappear, and how his love had never come with conditions. And then I wrote about this version of me who drank espresso in foreign cafes and wore a silver bracelet just because it sparkled in the sunlight. I didn't know who I'd become entirely, but I liked her. She didn't apologize for resting. She didn't rush to clean someone else's mess. She didn't ask permission to be happy. And best of all, she didn't belong to anyone but herself. When I returned to the hotel that evening, there was a message waiting for me at the front desk. It was a fax, a relic from another era that someone named Eileen Porter had asked them to print and deliver. I unfolded it slowly, recognizing my granddaughter's neat handwriting immediately. Every loop and curve pressed onto the page with care. "Dear Grandma," it began, "I hope this reaches you because Dad said he wasn't sure how to get in touch, and Mom still won't stop yelling." I smiled despite myself. "I miss you. Christmas was weird without you, and everyone acted like it was your fault, but I knew better." I told Tyler that you probably went somewhere warm and peaceful. I'm glad you did. I hope you're eating pastries and walking in the sun and not thinking about turkeys or tablecloths. I love you. Please write back if you can. I sat down in the hotel's small lounge area, the fire flickering in the hearth, and wrote a reply right then and there. Dearest Lily, I began, you are wiser than most adults I know. I told her I was safe, that I was in Lisbon, and that yes, I had eaten far too many pastries already. I didn't tell her the ugly parts, the shouting, the entitlement, the loneliness, but I did say I felt free. Sometimes grown-ups forget that they can choose peace over noise. I wrote, sometimes we stay too long in places that don't see us. I promised her a postcard and signed it with a heart and her favorite phrase, love you to the moon and back. I asked the front desk to send it with the return address she'd provided and slipped a pressed flower inside the envelope for good measure. That night I slept better than I had in months, dreaming of running barefoot through fields of lavender, hand in hand with the girl I used to be. The next day, I went on a walking tour of Alfama, the oldest district in Lisbon, all winding staircases and laundry flapping like flags of surrender. Our guide, a woman named Clara, had lived there her whole life and told stories like they were spells, each one casting a vision of a past still breathing in the stones. We passed fado bars tucked into hidden courtyards, heard about fishermen who sang love songs to the sea, and saw tiles that had survived earthquakes and dictatorships. Clara paused in front of a crumbling wall covered in blue azulejos and said, "These are the stories that remain when no one remembers your name." I thought about all the years I'd been quietly writing my story in acts of service, unseen by the very people I served. I wondered what tiles I had left behind, what stories might still cling to casseroles and clean laundry and scraped knees. But here, in this sun-drenched alley, I felt the urge to start a new story entirely. One where I wasn't the background character. One where I didn't wait for someone else to notice I was missing. Later that evening, as I sipped lemon tea in the lobby, I saw Ingrid again. She had shopping bags hanging from both arms and a delighted grin stretched across her face. "I bought a hat," she said, holding up a floppy, embroidered thing that made her look like a glamorous extra in an old movie. I laughed and told her she looked like someone escaping scandal in Monte Carlo. We sat and shared almond cookies and talked about how the world shifts when no one expects anything from you. "You know what I realized?" Ingrid said between bites. "I don't miss being needed. I thought I would, but I don't." That hit me in the chest. Not like a blow, but like a door swinging open. I didn't miss it either. Not the kind they gave me. 2 days later, I received another fax from Lily, this one with a sketch at the bottom. It was a drawing of the two of us on a beach, waves curling at our toes, our hands joined like puzzle pieces. "I showed Tyler your letter," she wrote, "and we looked up Lisbon on the map. I hope someday we can go there with you, maybe even next Christmas if you want." Her letter was full of hope, not pleading, and that made all the difference. "Dad says he's trying," she added. "He told Mom to stop blaming you and to start looking at herself." She didn't like that. I laughed softly, imagining the scene, and hoped Eric had the strength to follow through. Lily ended the letter with, "No matter what happens, I'm on your side." It was enough to bring tears to my eyes. I started taking long walks by the river each morning, watching the boats come and go like thoughts drifting in and out of consciousness. I didn't check my phone anymore. Not for Amber's fury, not for Eric's guilt, not even for the messages that tried to disguise control as concern. I'd said what I needed to say, and anything beyond that was noise. In the stillness of those walks, I started to notice small things again, the curve of a bird's wing, the laughter of a child chasing pigeons, the way strangers smiled with their whole faces. I bought a leather-bound journal from a street vendor and began sketching the places I visited. I wasn't any good at it, but I didn't care. These drawings weren't for display. They were proof I'd been here, that I'd chosen something just for myself. The hotel concierge, Miguel, became a familiar face. Always kind, always respectful, never prying. One morning, he told me there was a weekly gathering of local writers and artists at a nearby cafe, and asked if I'd be interested. I surprised myself by saying yes. That evening, I walked into a dim cafe, strung with lights and filled with the low hum of creative minds. I didn't know anyone, But someone waved me over to their table, and just like that, I belonged. We shared poems, doodles, half-finished essays, stories told in halting English and fluent feeling. I read a paragraph from my journal about the woman on the cliff painting and how she reminded me of who I used to be. When I finished, a man across the table said, "That woman found her wind." And I realized, so had I. On the last morning of my extended stay, I sat on my balcony and looked out over the red roofs and early fog, thinking about what came next. I didn't feel pulled home, not yet, but I didn't feel afraid of it either. I knew now that returning didn't have to mean surrendering. If I ever stepped back into that house, it would be on my terms, with new boundaries, and a clear sense of my worth. Maybe I would find a small apartment near Lily's school, somewhere with windows and morning light, and no need to ask permission to decorate. Maybe I'd keep traveling, follow the coast south, let Portugal become the first chapter in a longer story. I didn't need to decide today. Today, I just needed to breathe and believe that the life I wanted didn't require anyone's permission. I was not someone's helper. I was Eileen Porter. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough. The day I left Lisbon, the sky was overcast, as if the city itself was reluctant to see me go. I stood in the hotel lobby with my luggage, the bracelet Ingrid had gifted me jingling softly on my wrist. Miguel handed me a small parcel, almond pastries wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine, and said, "From everyone here for your journey." I hugged him, something I never would have done just a month ago, and thanked him for making me feel like more than a guest. Outside, the taxi waited with its hazard lights blinking, and the driver helped me load my bag without asking a single question. As we pulled away, I looked back at the iron balconies and cobbled streets, promising myself I'd return someday, not to escape, but to celebrate. At the airport, I walked slower than usual, trying to stretch out the feeling of belonging I'd found in Lisbon. I didn't know what waited for me on the other side of the Atlantic, and I wasn't in a hurry to find out. I had a connecting flight through New York and a notebook full of sketches to keep me company. Somewhere over the ocean, I let myself cry. Not out of sadness, but out of gratitude. When I landed at JFK, my phone buzzed to life with a new voicemail from Eric. "Mom, I hope you're still safe. I wanted to let you know that Amber and I are separating." I froze in place, the words washing over me in waves of disbelief and quiet understanding. "It's been coming for a long time," he continued, his voice more tired than I'd ever heard it. "Christmas was just the spark that lit the fuse. I've been in denial about how bad it's gotten." He paused, then added, "You were right, even if it hurt to realize it that way. I want to be better. I want to be someone Lily can look up to again. If you ever decide to come back, I hope it's not out of obligation, but because you want to see what I've become." I sat on a bench in the arrivals hall, letting those words settle, and suddenly the weight I'd carried for years felt a little lighter. My final flight landed in Chicago, just as the sky turned lavender with dusk, and the cold hit me like a slap the moment I stepped outside. I'd arranged to stay at a small inn near Lake Michigan for the week, a quiet place with a fireplace in every room and no curious relatives knocking at my door. I had no desire to return to Eric and Amber's house, even if she had moved out or been asked to leave. That place held too many ghosts, of my servitude, of their silence, of my own forgetting. The innkeeper, a woman named Ruth with silver hair and a wicked sense of humor, showed me to my suite and poured me a mug of hot cider without asking a thing. "Just breathe," she said, patting my shoulder before disappearing. I did just that. Breathed in, breathed out, let the cold seep from my bones and the warmth take its place. That night, I watched snow fall through the window and didn't think once about casseroles or chores or what anyone expected from me. I thought about the cliffs of Sintra and the woman I'd written into my journal, the one who finally heard her own voice. 2 days later, I received another letter from Lily, this time a real one, stamped and postmarked and sealed with a purple sticker shaped like a cat. Inside she wrote, "Grandma, I'm glad you're home, even if you're not really home." That phrasing made me smile because it told me she understood more than I gave her credit for. "Dad says we might move," she continued. He's been cooking a lot and doing laundry and even taught me how to make grilled cheese without burning it. It's weird, but I think I like it. He talks to us more now. Not like, "How was school?" and then walks away, but really talks. I think he misses you. I miss you too. Maybe we could go somewhere together this summer. Just us girls. Her P.S. read, "I kept the postcard you sent under my pillow. It smells like flowers and makes me dream about Portugal." I called Eric that night, more curious than convinced, and he picked up on the first ring. "Mom." He breathed, like he hadn't dared hope I'd actually call. His voice was still raw around the edges, but it lacked the brittle defensiveness I'd grown used to. "I didn't expect anything from you," he said quickly, "but I'm glad you reached out." I listened as he explained the separation. How Amber had packed her things 3 days after New Year's and gone to stay with her sister. He didn't vilify her, but he didn't excuse her either. "She's not all bad," he said, "but she was never going to see you the way you deserve to be seen." That acknowledgement meant more than any apology he could have given. "I want to do better," he said again. "For Lily, for Tyler, and maybe, eventually, for you too." I told him we'd see. I meant it kindly. Over the next week, I walked the snowy trails near the lake each morning, bundled in layers and watching my breath rise in puffs like speech. I passed joggers, dog walkers, retired couples on morning strolls, and I never once wished I were somewhere else. Each evening, I curled up by the fireplace with my journal and a book borrowed from the inn's tiny library. Mostly poetry, sometimes essays about travel and aging and rediscovery. I wrote down dreams I didn't yet know how to chase. A tiny house filled with light, a garden I didn't have to share, a class in watercolor painting, maybe even a part-time job at a bookstore, just for the joy of being around stories. I didn't need a grand plan. I just needed the courage to keep saying yes to myself. I even started researching apartments online. Not in Eric's neighborhood, but nearby enough to visit when I wanted and retreat when I needed. The idea didn't scare me. It thrilled me. I was building something, not a legacy, not a sacrifice, but a life. One afternoon, I sat by the fireplace rereading Lily's last letter when Ruth walked by and glanced at the drawing inside. "Your granddaughter?" she asked. And I nodded, beaming. Ruth sat across from me and studied the sketch of the two of us on the beach, her expression soft. "You know, I've met a lot of women who end up here in the winter," she said. "They come looking for quiet, but what they really need is to hear themselves think again." I knew exactly what she meant. She told me she'd left a 20-year marriage in her 60s, moved to a cabin near the lake, and hadn't looked back. "People thought I was running away," she said. "But I was really just walking toward something I hadn't found yet." That stuck with me long after she stood up and left me alone again with my thoughts and the fire. I wasn't running either. I was walking forward, maybe for the first time in decades. If you're still listening to my story, please take a moment to subscribe. It only takes a few seconds for you, but it makes a big difference for me. On my last morning at the inn, I walked down to the frozen lake with a cup of hot tea and the letter I'd been writing for days. It was addressed to myself, though I wasn't sure if I'd ever need to open it again. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting orange and pink light across the ice, and I sat on a snow-covered bench with the letter in my lap. "Dear Eileen," it began, "you left and the world didn't fall apart. You chose peace and the sky didn't collapse. You chose yourself, and look, you are still here." I wrote about the quiet courage it took to walk away from people who expected everything and offered nothing in return. I wrote about Lisbon and the woman on the cliff. I wrote about Lily's drawings and Eric's voice, worn and human, finally reaching me through the noise. Then I folded the letter and tucked it into the back of my journal, a time capsule for the version of me that needed reminding. Some mornings, freedom looked like airports and almond cakes. Other days, it looked like holding your own hand and not letting go. That afternoon, I toured 3 apartment buildings in Evanston, all within walking distance of the lake and a bookstore that smelled like vanilla and old pages. The first was too dark, the second too noisy, but the third made my heart skip, the kind of quiet charm that made you exhale without realizing you were holding your breath. It had a small balcony, worn hardwood floors, and built-in bookshelves just begging to be filled. I imagined a yellow armchair in the corner, morning sunlight streaming in as I sipped coffee and ignored every urgent text message that never came. The leasing agent, a woman named Priya, walked me through the space without the pushiness I'd come to expect from people selling you things. "It's a good place to start over," she said casually, not knowing how those words landed like gospel. I signed the lease 2 days later and gave Ruth a long hug before I left the inn. She didn't ask questions, just whispered, "You're going to be just fine." And for once, I believed it. Moving in was easier than I expected, mostly because I didn't have much to bring with me. I had a suitcase, a journal, my clothes, and the painting of the woman on the cliff that I'd carried carefully across the ocean. Eric helps me carry up a few boxes of dishes I'd left in storage, and I let him. We didn't talk much at first, but it wasn't an awkward silence. It was a respectful one, filled with understanding rather than avoidance. After we'd finished, he stood in the middle of my new kitchen and looked around with soft eyes. "It suits you," he said quietly. I offered him a cup of tea, and we sat on the floor sipping in companionable quiet. He didn't apologize again, and I didn't demand that he did. Sometimes healing didn't come from the words, but from what people did after the silence. And Eric, at least for now, was showing up. Later that week, Lily and Tyler came over after school with a paper bag full of scones and a handmade card that said, "Welcome home, Grandma," in glittery letters. I hadn't realized how much I missed being called that until Lily shouted it as she ran through my front door. They wandered the empty rooms with wide eyes, pointing out where I should put a table, which windows would be best for plants, and where I should hang the painting. "You could put a reading nook right here," Tyler said, climbing onto the windowsill. I promised I'd buy beanbags just for them, and they both beamed like I'd just offered them a pony. Lily pulled me aside in the kitchen and whispered, "Mom says you abandoned us, but I think you just saved yourself." I didn't correct her. She wasn't wrong. Children always notice more than adults give them credit for, especially when the truth sits quiet behind every conversation. Amber didn't reach out again, though I'd heard through Eric that she'd hired a lawyer. I didn't ask for updates because I didn't need them. The drama that used to ensnare me like barbed wire no longer belonged to me. I had stepped out of that story, and no one could write me back into it without my permission. Eric said they were handling custody peacefully for now, though Amber still bristled at any mention of me. "She's telling people you ran away to punish us," he'd said once, almost sheepishly. I shrugged. "Let her tell whatever story she needs to tell. I know mine." And truly, I didn't care. Not because I'd stopped feeling, but because I'd started choosing what deserved my energy. And she didn't make the list anymore. I started attending an art class every Saturday morning at a community center down the street. It was mostly women like me, women who had once been wives, mothers, caretakers, volunteers, housekeepers, all wrapped into one exhausted person. Now we were painters, learners, friends. Our teacher Dahlia encouraged us to paint without purpose, to let our hands move without worrying about meaning or skill. My first canvas was terrible, muddy, and shapeless. But I loved it. There was something holy about creating without being useful, about making messes that no one expected me to clean. After class, we'd sit in the courtyard and sip coffee from thermoses, talking about everything and nothing. "You're different," one of them said to me after a few weeks. "You have a stillness in your eyes, like someone who stopped running." I smiled. She wasn't wrong. One evening in late February, I received a small package in the mail, postmarked from Lisbon. Inside was a note from Ingrid and a folded cloth bag with our cafe, S logo embroidered in blue thread. "For market days and memories," her letter said. "You helped me remember myself. Come visit again, and next time we'll go dancing." I held the bag to my chest and laughed, surprised by how quickly my heart filled. Lisbon hadn't just been an escape, it had been a return. A place where parts of me I'd buried under casseroles and silence came back to life. I hung the bag by the front door like a promise. I would return someday, not as a runaway, but as a woman who knew her worth. That night, I poured a glass of wine, lit a candle on my new kitchen table, and sat down to write. I didn't know who the letter was for this time. Maybe Lily, maybe Ingrid, maybe a future me who might one day forget. I wrote about cliffs and courage, about freedom that comes wrapped in uncertainty, and lavender-scented air. I wrote that no one is too old to start over, no matter what anyone says. And I wrote that sometimes the greatest rebellion isn't anger or revenge, it's joy. Quiet, deliberate joy that no one can take away. I signed it, folded it, and tucked it next to my painting. Then I turned on some soft music, curled up in my yellow armchair, and watched the snow begin to fall. My life, at last, was mine. March arrived with its usual uncertainty. Sunlight one day, snow flurries the next, as if the seasons were arguing over who had the floor. I didn't mind the back and forth. It reminded me that change rarely happens all at once. My apartment slowly filled with color. A turquoise rug in the living room, a thrifted floral chair by the window, and a row of potted herbs on the sill that made the place smell like spring even when it was snowing. Every item I brought in felt like a quiet declaration. I live here and I belong. I joined a neighborhood book club that met in the back of a used bookstore. And our first read was a novel about a woman who reinvents herself after losing everything. It felt a little too on the nose, but I finished it in 2 days and dog-eared half the pages. The women there welcomed me easily. No questions about my past, no awkward silences when I said I'd just moved out of a family home. We laughed about the book's ending and argued over the protagonist's decisions like we were discussing old friends. It felt easy in a way that my old life never had. And ease, I'd learned, was not the same as laziness. It was a kind of grace. One Saturday, Eric invited me to lunch, just the two of us. No kids and no pretense. We met at a small diner near the lake, the kind with chipped mugs and laminated menus that hadn't changed since the 90s. He looked tired but more present than I'd seen him in years, his phone face down on the table like a silent apology. We made small talk over grilled cheese and tomato soup, and for once, it wasn't heavy with tension or veiled resentment. "I wanted to thank you," he said finally, stirring his coffee with a trembling spoon. "For leaving. I didn't see it then, but you saved me too." I blinked, surprised by the clarity of his words. "We were drowning in that house," he continued. "And I kept thinking that if I just kept the peace, everything would stay intact. But you breaking away, it forced me to look at everything I was pretending not to see." I didn't interrupt. I just listened, which, oddly enough, felt like the most powerful thing I could do. After lunch, we walked slowly down the lakefront path, the breeze cold but bracing. Eric told me he was seeing a therapist now, someone who specialized in post-divorce family dynamics. He didn't go into details about the sessions, and I didn't ask. Some things are sacred, even between mother and son. "Lily's doing better," he added quietly. "She's more confident. I think seeing you take care of yourself helped her realize she can do the same." That was the kind of sentence that stays with you for years. I thought about how often girls are taught to give, to please, to smooth things over, and how rarely they're shown what it looks like to say no with love. "Tyler's still quiet," Eric added, "but he started drawing again. He used to love it, remember?" I nodded, remembering crayon galaxies on the fridge and doodled monsters in his notebooks. We parted with a hug that didn't feel obligatory. And as I watched him walk away, I thought maybe we'd finally begun to know each other again, not as mother and son, but as people. A week later, Lily came over after school, arms full of sketchbooks and a plastic bag of chocolate-covered almonds she'd bought with her allowance. "We're doing self-portraits in art class," she said, flopping onto the beanbag by the window. "But mine doesn't look like me." I sat beside her, handing her a cup of tea the way I always used to when she was little. She opened her sketchbook and showed me a pencil drawing of a girl with huge eyes, hair wild like seaweed and a bird perched on her shoulder. "That's not what you look like on the outside," I said gently, "but maybe it's what you feel like on the inside." She looked at me then, eyes wide. "That's exactly it." We spent the next hour drawing imaginary versions of ourselves. I gave myself a fox's tail and long boots. She gave herself dragon wings and stars in her hair. It was silly and wonderful and healing in ways I couldn't explain. That night, I wrote another letter to myself. Shorter this time, but no less meaningful. "You did the right thing," it began. "You walked away, and you didn't crumble." I wrote it because even in healing, doubt sometimes crept in like fog around the edges. I didn't want to forget what it had taken to choose myself. I taped the letter to the inside of my closet door, hidden behind my scarves, a little secret between me and my braver self. Whenever I reached for my shawl, the same one I wore in Lisbon, I saw the letter and remembered what I'd lived through. Remembered how far I'd come from the woman who stood quietly in kitchens, waiting to be thanked. I didn't need applause, but I did need truth. And truth, I'd found, was best kept where I could see it. Especially on the quiet days, when memory knocked too gently to be ignored. One evening in April, I got a call from Ingrid, her voice bubbling with excitement from halfway around the world. "Guess what?" she said. "I'm coming to Chicago this summer. My niece lives in the suburbs, and I'm staying for a whole month." We made plans to meet, to visit the art museum, and sit by the lake and toast our hard-earned freedom with something sweet and strong. "Bring the cafe bag," she said, "and I'll bring our favorite biscuits." We laughed, and it struck me how strange and beautiful it was to have made a lifelong friend in just a few afternoons in a foreign city. But that was what happened when you met people who saw you fully. You didn't need years, just truth. After we hung up, I sat on my balcony, watching the wind play with the leaves in the trees below. I didn't know what summer would bring, but I knew it would bring joy. And that was enough. It was more than enough. Tyler called me a few days later, surprising me with a voice deeper than I remembered. "Hey, Grandma," he said awkwardly. "I have to do this oral history project for school, and I picked you." I blinked, heart stuttering a bit. "Me?" "Yeah," he said. "We're supposed to interview someone who changed the course of their life after 50. I laughed. Really laughed. The kind that makes your ribs ache. "I think I qualify," I said. "Yeah," he replied. "You definitely do." Tyler's project turned into one of the most unexpectedly beautiful afternoons of my year. He came over with a notepad, a cheap voice recorder, and a nervous energy that reminded me of Eric at his age. We sat at my kitchen table with mugs of cocoa and a plate of lemon cookies I'd made from a recipe I found tucked into one of Frank's old notebooks. "So, Tyler began, glancing down at his questions. "Can you tell me about a time you made a life-changing decision?" I smiled, taking a slow sip before answering. "Last Christmas Eve, I booked a flight to Portugal instead of cooking dinner for 40 people. His eyebrows shot up, and I saw the moment it clicked that this wasn't just a family anecdote. It was my story. I told him everything in pieces, careful not to place blame, but also not shielding the truth. I told him how it felt to be erased quietly over years, to be useful but never valued, present but invisible. He didn't interrupt. He just listened, the recorder blinking between us like a silent witness. After I finished, he was quiet for a long time, chewing on his lip like he always did when he was thinking hard. "Grandma," he said finally, "why didn't you ever tell us you were unhappy?" I looked out the window for a moment before answering, watching a squirrel dart across the branches. "Because I didn't fully realize it myself until I left. Sometimes it takes distance to see how small you've become trying to fit into other people's lives." He nodded slowly, scribbling something into his notebook. "Was it scary?" he asked. "Yes," I said, "but being invisible in your own life is scarier." He didn't speak again for a while, and when he did, it was only to say, "I'm glad you chose you." That night, after he left, I cried, not from regret, but from the sheer weight of being understood by someone I loved. Spring arrived in earnest the next week, and the whole city seemed to stretch its limbs after a long sleep. Tulips sprouted in neat rows outside the library, and neighbors emerged onto porches with cups of tea and the first brave paperback novels of the season. I started walking to the farmer's market on Saturdays, with my cafe bag slung over one shoulder, the same one Ingrid had given me in Lisbon. It had faded slightly from use, but that only made me love it more, like a worn story you return to because it still knows your name. I bought asparagus and fresh bread and honey from a man with weathered hands who always remembered my name. I no longer rushed through the market or tried to get everything on a list. I let myself wander and talk and sample things I didn't need. At home, I'd make simple lunches on the balcony, goat cheese, fruit, warm bread, and eat slowly, watching the sunlight climb across the floor. Sometimes I sketched the vendors, other times I just watched the birds. It was a small life, but it was mine. One afternoon in May, Lily asked if she could interview me too. Not for school, she clarified. just because I want to know more. We walked through a park not far from my apartment, the kind with a duck pond and benches made of stone that warmed in the sun. "What was it like to be in love with Grandpa Frank?" she asked, out of nowhere, and I smiled at the question. I told her how he made me laugh in quiet ways, how he always poured my tea before his own, how he once drove 3 hours just to bring me a sweater I forgot. "Was it perfect?" she asked. "No," I said, "but it was kind, and kind is better than perfect." She leaned against my arm, and we walked in silence for a while, ducks quacking in the distance, time slowing to a hush. Eric texted me later that week with a photo of Tyler's oral history project, a binder with pages carefully typed, photos pasted in, and a quote on the cover that made me stop mid-step. "Sometimes we leave so we can come back as ourselves." I didn't remember saying it, but I knew it came from me. It felt like something I'd found in Lisbon between cafe tables and church bells. "He got an A," Eric wrote, followed by, "He said he wants to be brave like you." I stared at the message for a long time, letting it unfurl inside me like a sail catching wind. I hadn't tried to teach my grandchildren anything, really. I'd only tried to save myself. But somehow, in the process of reclaiming my life, I'd shown them something important. That love doesn't mean obedience. That worth doesn't mean servitude. That being a mother or a grandmother or a woman doesn't mean disappearing. The art class at the community center hosted a spring showcase in early June, and Dahlia insisted I submit a few pieces. I chose 3. The messy abstract I'd painted on my first day, the woman on the cliff sketched in charcoal, and a soft watercolor of my Lisbon balcony. They weren't masterpieces, but they were real, and that felt more important than polish. The night of the showcase, Lily came with me, wearing a dress she said made her feel like someone who reads poetry in cafes. She walked between the paintings with reverence, stopping in front of mine with wide eyes and a proud smile. "You made this," she whispered. "Yes," I whispered back. "From scratch?" she asked, incredulous. "From scratch," I said, my voice full of quiet joy. She turned back to the painting, then slipped her hand into mine, and we stood there together, both a little taller somehow. Later that evening, after the showcase ended and the lights dimmed, I walked home alone under a sky just beginning to purple with stars. I didn't feel lonely. I felt full. Of stories, of memories, of possibilities still unfolding. My steps echoed softly on the sidewalk, a rhythm I hadn't known I was learning these past few months. One that said, "I am here. I am whole. I am not what was taken from me. I am what I chose to become." And there, beneath that quiet sky, I realized something else. I had been the Christmas miracle all along. I just needed to believe it. Summer arrived like a soft hymn, not blaring or boastful, but warm and steady, full of second chances. I filled my days with small, deliberate joys. Morning walks along the lake, sketching wildflowers in my notebook, reading novels I'd once deemed too frivolous. Lily came over often, sometimes with Tyler, sometimes alone, always with questions that made me think harder about myself than I ever had before. "Do you think love can change people?" she asked once, legs dangling over my balcony railing, eyes squinting into the sun. "I think real love doesn't try to change people," I said after a pause, "but it can give them the space to change themselves." She nodded, satisfied, as if storing that away for some future heartbreak or decision. Eric stopped by less often, but when he did, it was with no expectations. He brought groceries or books or just himself, and we'd sit quietly like people who had forgiven each other the right way. Not all at once, but inch by inch. Amber, as far as I knew, had moved in with her sister permanently, and neither Eric nor the children talked about her unless I asked. One evening in July, I received a postcard from Ingrid, mailed from a cafe in Spain, where she said the orange cake was nearly as good as the ones we'd shared in Lisbon. "I miss you," she wrote in her loopy cursive. "When are you coming back to Europe so we can get lost again?" I smiled and pinned it beside my kitchen calendar, just below Lily's beach drawing and above Tyler's self-portrait. A boy with thoughtful eyes and a backpack full of books. I hadn't decided when I'd travel again, but the question no longer made me flinch. The idea of being far from family didn't feel like escape anymore. It felt like freedom paired with intention, like choosing joy instead of waiting for permission. I hadn't told anyone yet, but I'd started researching artist residencies abroad, quiet ones in coastal towns that welcomed older women with stories to tell. I wasn't sure if I'd apply this year or the next, but the very act of imagining it made my heart beat faster. And after years of keeping my dreams quiet to avoid rocking the boat, I'd finally learned that boats are meant to move. Stillness, after all, isn't always peace. It's sometimes just fear in disguise. August brought Ingrid herself to Chicago, just as she promised, suitcase in one hand and sun hat in the other. We hugged in front of the arrivals terminal like teenagers, laughing too loudly and drawing stares we didn't care about. "You've aged in reverse," she said as I led her to my car. "That's what happens when you stop asking people for permission to breathe," I replied, and she threw her head back and laughed. We spent a week doing everything and nothing. Museum visits, lazy brunches, thrift store hunting, and one glorious afternoon lying on a blanket in the park reading our favorite lines aloud to each other. Lily joined us for a day and asked Ingrid a million questions about travel, art, and whether it was true you could eat breakfast wine in Italy. Ingrid said, "You can, but only if you also eat cake." And Lily looked at me like she'd found a new life goal. That night, over pasta and candlelight on my balcony, Ingrid told me, "You saved yourself, and in doing so, you lit a path for the rest of us." I didn't know how to respond, so I just poured her more wine. The day before Ingrid left, she gave me a small box wrapped in matte print paper and sealed with a sticker of a passport. Inside was a necklace, simple and silver, with a tiny charm shaped like a paper airplane. "For your next flight," she said. I held it in my palm for a long time, feeling the cool weight of it, the symbolism stitched into its delicate frame. "You're not just someone who left," she said. "You're someone who arrived. Don't forget that." I wore it the next day when we dropped her at the airport, and I haven't taken it off since. It rests near my collarbone like a compass, not telling me where to go, but reminding me I can. That afternoon, I started a new sketch, my first in weeks. A woman standing at the edge of water, her arms outstretched, not to fly, but to feel the wind and stay rooted. She was me. And she wasn't afraid anymore. By September, the leaves had just begun to brown at the edges, whispering of the change to come, and I found myself thinking often about that Christmas dinner I never made. I wondered who ended up hosting, who brought what, whether anyone mentioned my name or just changed the subject. I didn't feel guilt anymore, only a soft sense of distance, like watching someone else's life from the other side of a glass wall. I had stepped out of that story because it didn't fit anymore, because I deserved one that was mine. One where I didn't need to perform worthiness in casseroles and clean floors. One where I could be tired without apologizing. One where I could rest and still be loved. And that kind of story, well, I was still writing it. Every day, in every quiet decision to remain free, I picked up the pen again. On the first cold morning of fall, I invited Eric and the kids over for soup and bread. No occasion, no expectations. They arrived with paper bags of apples, giggles, and a stack of library books. Lily insisted. I absolutely had to read. We ate by candlelight as rain tapped gently against the windows, and Tyler told me he'd joined the art club at school. "They let us use real charcoal," he said, eyes shining. "It's messy and amazing." After dinner, Lily curled up on the couch with one of the throw blankets I'd crocheted years ago, the same one Amber used to hide during parties because it didn't match her aesthetic. Eric cleared the dishes without me asking, and when I tried to help, he smiled and said, "Just sit, Mom." And so I did. Watched my grown son carry plates and pour tea and be present in a way I never thought I'd see again. No one said thank you in a grand way, but their presence was thanks enough. That night, after they left, I sat at the kitchen table and opened my journal to a fresh page. At the top, I wrote, "Christmas is coming." Then underneath, "And this year, I'm not cooking for 40 people. I'm cooking for 3, maybe 4. And it will be quiet and joyful and messy, and I will ask for help, and I will accept it. Because I am not here to serve. I am here to live." I closed the journal and placed it next to the painting. The woman on the cliff, her hair forever tangled in sea wind, her face turned toward the horizon. That woman was no longer someone I dreamed of being. She was me, at last. Thank you for listening to my story. Before you leave, there's another story similar to the one you just watched. You'll see it on the top left of your screen.